Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chelsea Cusimano, and I'm the Executive Administrator at NAATP. Today's presentation is titled Telling the Truth, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Addiction Recovery World. Today's presenter is Phil Rutherford, Chief Operating Officer at Faces and Voices of Recovery. Let me first start by saying thank you to all of you for attending today's webinar. Before we begin, I'll be going through some logistics about how this webinar will run. Next week, we'll be picking back up with our state advocacy webinar series. Registration is now open for all webinars in this series, so please visit our website, naatp.org, to sign up. We will be posting the recording of today's presentation on our website this afternoon. We will send a follow-up email on Monday that will include the presentation recording, CE credit, and the PowerPoint slideshow as well. Our presenter today will be answering attendee questions throughout the presentation. So please type your questions as they come up into the question dropdown on the webinar control panel, and we'll address them as they come in. Thank you all again for attending. Thank you so much to our presenter for being here with us today to discuss this important topic. And now I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks a lot, Chelsea. So, as mentioned, my name is Phil Rutherford. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Faces and Voices of Recovery. And we're going to talk today about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the addiction recovery world. The title of the presentation is Telling the Truth. I don't think that anyone is necessarily lying about it, but I chose that subject because of late, it's come up a lot in the news. I don't know if anyone's been watching, but it seems like we're having a bit of a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the rest of the world. So one of the things that I was talking to Chelsea prior to getting started here today is that this format is really tough in that I don't get the kind of audience response, right? So I'm used to speaking to an audience and having a little bit of audience feedback, like, hey, I like to tell a joke now and then, so I want to know if my jokes are landing. In this format, I have no idea. So I might think that something I'm saying is terribly funny and it might not be working. So you'll have to bear with me on that. I'll try to keep the sarcasm and snark to a minimum, but that's difficult for me. So back to the subject. Chelsea mentioned that I want questions throughout. I do mean that because I think this particular subject, I am giving a perspective. I've been doing cultural competency work now for a number of years, and I have a perspective on it. But I think the important part about this is that it's a journey. So it's important to me that as we go through, if there are questions, if there are things that come up, I want to hear about them now and kind of deal with them as we go. So first things first, where are we? Again, this would be a place for someone with a sense of humor, a smart aleck. Someone would yell out, Earth, where, why don't you know where you are, that sort of thing. But the bottom line is, I think all of us come at this work from different spaces. There are different life situations. We look different, and we come at this from different places. In the spirit of full disclosure, I've been Black all my life, so I'm gonna see. There's one of those jokes that I don't know if it landed or not, but I wanna make sure that there is space for people to talk about where they come from and how they arrived at this work. So I'm hoping that I get some good questions. I think one thing, though, is abundantly clear, and that there has been a bit of a sea change probably in the last 2 or 3 months about the way the public at large is discussing matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's one thing. But the reason we're doing this is, what's the role of the treatment community, or maybe even the broader recovery community, in this discussion? I'll tell you a little bit about me. My recovery journey started it seems like a long time ago in a faraway galaxy, but I am a person living in long-term recovery, and I went through a variety of different treatment pathways. I found a home Hazelden, and you're not supposed to find a home there, right? So I went there a couple of times. I think the right way to do it is to go there once, but I went there a couple of times, and my life story includes a little bit of economic privilege in that I was able to afford insurance and I was able to get treatment at a place that not a lot of people that look like me seem to make it to. And so one of the things that, and while there, I found my way into some of the marketing pictures for the organization. I'm not sure how that happened. I'm sure it was 100% by random chance. But one of the things I noticed there was I didn't see a lot of people like me. And once I kind of got on my recovery journey, I started asking questions about that, like why in places like that. And that wasn't the only treatment center that I went to on my journey, but a lot of times in places like that, I didn't see a lot of people that looked like me. So I asked that question of people in charge, and I got a variety of answers. So it's not super relevant what those answers were, just because I think that my experience with the treatment community is that everyone, at least all the people that I came into contact with, were trying to do the best they could with the tools they had. But there's definitely something to be discussed, and we'll call it the elephant in the room, about the number of people that look like me in sort of private treatment. And that's not the subject of our discussion today. That's just something to kind of put a pin in, and we can talk about that later. But I think from kind of a big picture perspective, I want to talk about, when I say diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of times the thought process is that I'm talking about race, right? And that is certainly a component of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As I mentioned, back to the comment about being Black my whole life, I've known about race my whole life, or at least since I was, kind of consciously aware as a little kid. So that's part of it. But another thing that doesn't seem to get talked about a lot, at least in these conversations, is that there's a myriad of things that apply to culture, right? And one of the things that I work in is cultural competency. So there is there are issues of gender, there are issues of sexuality, there are issues of, I mentioned that I had economic privilege, and what I mean by that is that my parents had some education and some money, and that helped me to be in a position to make my way into a treatment situation that was a little bit different than, say, public funding. So there are all these components that fit into culture. There's also just ability, right? The ability to walk around and move my body, right? There's a certain amount of privilege associated with that. So when I talk about DEI, I'm talking about all of those things. The thing that's been most recently sort of front burner has been race, but there's more to it than that. So on that note, I want to start with some basic tenets, just kind of basic concepts. And I live in Rochester, Minnesota. And the reason I mention that is I'm married to a woman here that works at Mayo Clinic. And she has attended their cultural competency training. This is not anything bad about them. I'm sure wonderful training there. I've been to plenty of trainings prior to working in nonprofit. I worked in the corporate world and went to plenty of cultural competency trainings. And my wife, who happens to be white, described her experience at cultural competency trainings as where white people go to feel bad. And that is not what it is. In my experience, if that's the case, then I've failed. If I'm delivering a training and people just walk away feeling bad, that's not it. There's absolutely some stuff that needs to be talked about as it pertains to culture. There's some truths about the world. There's some truths about American history that I think are largely left out of general education that need to be talked about. But my hope is that if we sort of level set, and that's what it says on this slide, if we talk about some kind of ground rules or basic tenets, of cultural competency, I think it's a good place to start. So I don't see any questions yet. I'm not opposed to that. I'm curious if I've offended anyone yet, because that's sometimes a good thing if someone's had their button pushed this early, but we'll go on. So the basics. Every single thing that we do exists within a cultural context. Once in a while, I'll hear someone say, "Well, this isn't really about culture. Or this isn't really about that stuff. You know, this is just work, right? It's not about that stuff." There is an exercise that I typically do when I have the ability to have people in a room, where we have people go through and identify what cultures or what groups they're a part of, and there are a multitude of different cultural groups that people are a part of. So every single thing that you do, every piece of work that happens, every interaction exists within a cultural context. You may not be consciously aware of it, but everything exists in that context. We'll talk a little bit more about the second bullet, which is being culturally competent. It's a process. There's no endpoint. It's not like you don't arrive. When we're done with this hour talk, you won't be competent or woke, right? I'm not competent or woke. I'm on a journey, as we all are. Also, how-to and cookbook approaches, they don't work. When at Faces and Voices of Recovery, we started on this journey. We probably started on this journey unwittingly, or they started on that journey unwittingly when they hired me. And I've been there about 3 years now, and I think I spent the first year just kind of observing processes. I spent the second year kind of sort of poking the bear, as it were. And this year, definitely sort of really trying to push for some structural change to the way that we do stuff. And so other organizations, like we have an association that we are affiliated with. I mean, the recovery community organizations that we manage an association called ARCO, which is the Association of Recovery Community Organizations. And we've had a few feelers come out as we start to do this work. People say, well, how do we do this work? Well, there's not a cookbook for this. There's not a thing where you can open to page 63 and it says, how do I get more Black clients in the door? Or I want to be I want to be friendlier to the transgender community. What is it I need to do? That's not how this work happens. This work starts with these conversations. It starts with a lot of inside kind of personal work on bias and sort of your own personal bias, and then the change flows out from that. It's not unlike the recovery process that a lot of us are familiar with. So, stereotyping. Stereotyping is, I said that cookbooks and how-tos promote stereotyping. Stereotyping is not necessarily a bad thing. And I usually do this example when I'm sitting in a group of people, or even if we're on camera together, where I'll ask someone to describe what's behind them. Like in my case, I know, and I can see it in the camera, so it's not completely fair, but even without looking at the camera, I know what's behind me is a painting. And I could probably tell you some colors about it, and I could tell you roughly what size it is. And I know that there's a couch back there and some, I know there's carpet behind me. But the way that I know that is that my brain is storing an image of that. It's made a snapshot of it, because it doesn't have the onboard continuous processing power to perceive all of that at the same time. Now, I have no actual proof that stuff is back there. I just, because of object permanence, there's a part of my brain that says, okay, that stuff is back there, and it's telling me a story that stuff is behind me. That's kind of how stereotyping works, right? My brain gets a piece of information, and it layers that onto future experience, whether or not that piece of information is valid or not. And in some cases, I think of the case of someone that doesn't have a lot of experience with a particular culture, and the one experience they have is negative, or maybe they have no experience and they only see what they see on TV or on the internet, that overlays the entire experience. So it's a normal part of the brain. It's a natural thing, but it's important that we work against it. So I also mentioned that this work is messy. I asked about someone maybe getting their feelings hurt yet. I've been pretty tame thus far, but the nature of this work is that some toes will be trampled. We had a diversity, equity, and inclusion forum a couple of weeks ago. In fact, we're coming up on one just next week, so I'll do a plug for that. It's on, I want to say July 14th at 6 p.m. And at that event, there was something said in one of the breakout sessions that was really offensive to someone. It was really someone felt really invalidated and not particularly respected by a comment that was made by another person that was participating in the group. And the way we do that is we had hundreds of people, but we broke the groups out into smaller groups. And that person, after the group, we came back and had sort of a debrief. That person came back and just read the person the riot act and shared about how unhappy they were with that experience, which, I don't know that there was necessarily a bunch of malice in what the person did, but it was evidence that this person had not had experience, and the person happened to be transgender. This person hadn't had a lot of experience in dealing with transgender or intersectionality, and said something that was very offensive. Now, here's why I bring that up. A couple things are really important about that exchange. Number one, it's important that the transgender woman in question was able to speak her truth. That was important. But it was equally important for the other person to hear the response and then do whatever they did with the response. And it wasn't our job to go and sort of see how that person was. But this work it's really important for people to just sort of have the experience. And I think that's another kind of key component. Last bullet here, almost the most important thing I'll probably say all day. Now, this is a question. I have a question for the group. Is there anyone in the group that is more than 200 years old? I'll wait for a second to see if anyone wants to vote or contact Chelsea. Anyone more than 200 years old? I'm not seeing any chat or anything of the sort. I'm going to assume that means no. No one here is personally responsible for institutional bias, not to blame, didn't set up the institution of slavery, didn't set up gender bias, didn't set up a system of wealth distribution. None of those things are anyone on this call's fault. And I think that's a really important piece to take into this work. Because there are some things that have happened across specifically American history that are horrible, that are unconscionable and unacceptable to me on a multitude of levels. That does not mean that it is someone on this call's fault. That being said, it is also important that we don't act as if they don't happen, because I think one of the things that happens, and I think this is just kind of going back to what happened on our DEI call, one of the things that happens is when I say, hey, this terrible thing happened, and someone says to me, well, you know what, Phil, that happened a long time ago, don't worry about it. That there's an invalidation that goes on there. And I think it makes it easier for me to go to my corner and say, well, this person doesn't understand, and for that person to go to their corner and say, this person's always angry, right? Why? And that may be a question that comes up. I hope someone asks, why are Black people always angry? If anyone has that question, please put it in the chat box. I'll be more than happy to unwrap that or unpack that, because I don't think Black people are always angry. Sometimes we are. So, so those are kind of the basic tenets of this work, and we're doing an hour session, so there's really not this training and this work typically. If I'm doing it with an organization, we do it over a couple of days or at least a number of sessions to do it. But I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a flavor for how we start the process. So I'll look in chat. Still no questions. All right. Maybe I need to say something really provocative and see if I can get some juices going. I mentioned that cultural competency was an endpoint. So I want to talk through the continuum, right? And on the far left of this slide, you see something culturally incompetent. And I tend, when in this case, I think of people coming to America, coming to the New World, which wasn't really the New World because there are already people here, but what was described as the New World. Before I get into that, I do see that there are a couple of questions, so let's have them. Chelsea, let her rip.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions. Let's start with, you said that no one here on this call is to blame or personally responsible for institutional racism or bias, but aren't we all responsible for its perpetuation?
That's an interesting perspective. I think that all of us can have a hand in the deconstruction of it, and we can all make attempts to it, but I don't know that I would go as far to say as that we're all personally responsible for deconstructing it, if that makes sense. And I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I think that there's a stage to it, right? And that's actually a great segue to what we're going to talk about in terms of moving from culturally incompetent to culturally competent. I think a morally sound human being who witnesses injustice probably, and they taught me in treatment not to should all over myself, so should, S-H-O-U-L-D, a morally fit person should want to fight against injustice, and if we identify injustice, it's appropriate to take steps to correct that. It's just that it's difficult for me to say that everyone should be doing that, because I don't know that that's fully accurate. I think that if you recognize it, then 100%, let's grab an oar and let's go.
Another question that we have. Oh, I'm so sorry, Phil. Were you done?
I was just going to say, hopefully that answers the question. If that person wants clarification, put it in chat and I'll take another stab at it.
The next question that we have is, can you speak to why it is offensive when people say, I don't see color or gender?
Also a wonderful segue. So I'm going to, I'll put a pin in that because I'm going to answer that by walking through this continuum, if that's okay. Are there more questions or was it just those two?
I think it's just going to be those two for right now.
So just bear with me one second and I'll get to that question as we walk through the continuum. So far left of the slide, culturally incompetent. Think of Cortez, Columbus, the folks that came to this continent and basically identified themselves as culturally superior to other cultures. And that was that. It was like, that's a wrap, right? Like, we're better, they're lesser, we're good, they're savages. We need to either subdue them or exterminate them. That's sort of the kind of the bottom of the ladder. And then I think the next step along that continuum is lacks cultural awareness and thinks there's only one way of doing things. And that kind of, again, moving to the right, maybe at least recognizing that there are these other cultures, but still the European way would be the right way. And again, I'm sticking to the North American model. So sees all the same people, thinks everyone should be treated the same. This is the response to that question. So I don't know if it is offensive, but I can tell you that it is culturally limited, right? So I don't know if seeing all people the same is offensive. It's just not fully culturally developed. So when you say to me that, so what a lot of times someone will say, and this has happened in some of the trainings that I've done, someone will say, "Hey Phil, I don't see color." My immediate response is, "My God, we need to call 911. We need to get you to a hospital because there's something wrong with the rods and the cones in your eyes, because there's something very wrong." So it's not so much that it is offensive, but it is a lack of awareness and a lack of acceptance of my culture. So when you say I don't see you as Black, you're denying my Blackness, right? And in the case of marginalized groups, right? So for someone to say I don't see you as the majority group, that really isn't particularly demeaning, because, and we'll see in an exercise that we're going to do here in a moment, being in a majority group has a certain set of rights and privileges associated with it. But in a marginalized group, when you say that you're not seeing that, you're sort of taking something away, right? And there's plenty of diversity and value. There's absolutely nothing wrong with me being Black, right? I think that what's underneath the concept is, I'm not going to treat you differently because you're Black, and that's fine. That's far better than the other two options. If we're reading the chart from right to left, that is far better than seeing yourself as culturally superior or lacking cultural awareness and thinking there's only one way of doing things. That is, seeing everyone the same is better, but it's not best. And sometimes what's good can be the enemy of what's best, because it is better to recognize a different culture and learn different things about them. I was reading an article in the Post yesterday about this group of Rhodes Scholars, which hopefully some on the call know what a Rhodes Scholar is. A Rhodes Scholar, I mean, it's a pretty prestigious designation. The fact that it's named after Cecil Rhodes, who's like one of the most vicious colonizers in the New World, that's a whole different story. But a Rhodes Scholar is someone that is very very respected, and they go off to Oxford to do some training. But they took some Rhodes Scholars. This year there's a bumper crop of Rhodes Scholars that happen to be Black, African American, and they took them to the Museum of African American History, the Smithsonian in DC, and there were literally like sections of that museum that they'd never been taught, that they'd never been exposed to. There's information in there that they'd never been exposed to, because the culture that there's not the same level of deference or respect for the culture as there is for the dominant majority culture. So that information is not even seen as important or relevant, even for a Rhodes Scholar, even for someone that is supposed to be a person of letters. That history is not taught. So that is the consequence of saying, okay, I don't see color, right? Because when you don't see color, it's not necessary to elevate or celebrate the marginalized culture. It's not relevant. And hopefully that answers the question. And again, if you want more detail, just hit the chat box or the question thing again and let me know. Next on the continuum, accepts, appreciates, and accommodates cultural differences, understands the effect that his or her culture has in relating to others, and then finally actively seeks knowledge about other cultures, educates others about cultural differences. So the sort of celebrating the difference, I think, is the thing that is valuable. So certainly we don't want to treat people differently or less than because of their culture, but there is much to be learned from celebrating the cultural differences. There are differences. There are cultural differences that exist in different groups. So I'll give you another quick example. So it was recently Juneteenth, and some of you may have just been hearing about it. I grew up in Texas, so Texas is very, Texas Juneteenth is, at least in the Black community, is mentioned quite a bit. I think most people in Texas know what it is because it's centered around when news of the Emancipation Proclamation was theoretically delivered to Galveston, and slavery was ordered to be ended by Union soldiers. And there was a discussion at my organization about, well, what we're going to do for Juneteenth, and it's Liberation Day, and it's an important day, right? It's the last day that slavery was government sanctioned, kind of. If you want more information about that, watch a film called 13th on Netflix. It's the last day that government sanctioned slavery actually existed. And the discussion was around, wasn't this really a good thing? And it kind of is, and it kind of isn't. But that history is not really taught, right? So in the case of my family, growing up as a kid, we never celebrated Juneteenth, and it was really particularly important to my parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents that we didn't participate in Juneteenth celebrations because my family was free long before that, right? So there's kind of a thing about being a freeman before slavery was actually ended. We earned our freedom and so on and so forth. And some of that's probably ego, and that's fine. But my point is, there are even within our culture, there are differences that are to be celebrated and understood. So just going back to, and not to beat a dead horse, but if you say, I see all the same, then you lose that richness. So hopefully that answered the question and I didn't beat it to death. Or I might have, but I don't know. You guys can't object, so I get to just keep talking. So this does have its benefits. Okay, any other questions filter in?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions, sort of clarifying or playing off of the earlier one that you spoke to. So clarifying that the earlier question was, do we all play a part in perpetuating these oppressive systems that continue to exist? And another related one, how do we handle someone who actively allows for these holdover institutions to stay around or continue perpetuating oppression?
Okay. Yep. And I like the clarification because the answer to the first question is yes, we all play a part. We do play a part. And again, get back to the recovery thing, right? When you know better, you do better, right? So there are a lot of things that I know today about life and the way to live and how to follow a recovery process and all of that I simply didn't know. And because of that, I behave differently. So yes, we all play a part. We all have some skin in the game here, 100%. That's actually, it's funny that came up because this is like I said, this is a pared down version of this presentation. That's actually one of the bullets that we all have a part. And then as for what to do with someone that wants to perpetuate or kind of that is intransigent or stuck in a spot, I think it's tricky, right? Because there's part of me as a Black man where I do this work, right? So it's easy for me to offer education in this context. There are plenty of people of color that don't want to do any more educating. They're like, we've been doing this for a long time. We're good. Go figure it out, right? And I'm not speaking for all people of color. That's not what I don't do that. So I think what's appropriate for the person that is stuck is to offer them some information. Now, what they do with that information, that part, again, in true recovery fashion, that part's on them, right? What I can tell you about some of the sort of structural things that I've found displeasure with even within the Faces and Voices structure and things that we're wanting to change is that I've called it out and said, this is what we need to change. Here's what we're going to do. And I've gained agreement with our board and our staff about here's what we're going to change and here's why. And not a lot of people have argued about it. So if you have your facts together and you have good information as to why things should change, then you're really just dealing with someone's personal bias. And I'm not telling you that you should back someone into a corner, but if the argument is just to keep the status quo, then that's not really a sound argument. There's a thing circulating, and there's one of the beautiful things about social media, which there's like two, but one of the beautiful things about social media is that there are all these glib sayings. And I saw one the other day that said, if you don't like the phrase Black Lives Matter, and you're okay with all lives matter, and you're okay with Blue Lives Matter, then the problem you have is with the word Black. And I like that. It's glib, but I like the logic there, which is if you can isolate what the actual problem is, then you at least force the person to say, okay, this is what my problem is, right? If you can eliminate all the excuses about, well, this will happen or that'll happen or this other thing is wrong or that other thing is wrong. If you can get down to what the core objection is, then you at least can have a moral discussion.
So we have another question that feels relevant to what you were just explaining. One attendee asked, you talk a bit about blame. Can you speak to why shaming people might not be an effective tool in enlightening?
Well, because it doesn't work. It doesn't. It's not particularly effective in motivating change. It is the thing is there is objective truth, right? And I mentioned there are two good things about social media. I can list 100 things wrong with it, but the sort of blurring of what objective truth actually is. There are some things that are objectively true about the history of America, right? And the way that America has behaved as it pertains to indigenous people, people of color, LGBTQ, women, the poor. There's some things that are absolute facts. So it is not appropriate to say, hey, this thing happened and you're a bad person because you support it. It is appropriate to say, this thing happened. Now, I'm going to make these changes to do something about it. This is how I'm responding to it. This is the change that I think I'm going to make. This is the change that my organization is going to make. Here's what we're going to do about it. But at the point where I'm saying, hey, you're bad because you don't believe that or don't know it, objective truth is objective truth. So if I'm dealing with someone that cannot accept objective truth, then I probably don't even need to be having that discussion, right? So, but again, and I know we're running a little short on time, so I'll quit running my mouth about this. But back to I made a quick comment. If you have questions about what happened with Juneteenth, watch the movie 13th. One of the things that happened as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a caveat in it that said slavery was illegal, except where there was a criminal offense. Well, almost immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation was ratified, there were all of these states that enacted laws that made it like illegal to be essentially living while black were the things. There are things called the pig laws, and there are these other laws like if someone said, hey, if someone said to a black person, hey, that's my pig, and the black person said, no, it's not, then the black person went to jail. And so I mean, there are all these things that happen that we know are true. They're on the books. I mean, we know that it happened. So like having that information at your disposal and sharing that with someone, if they don't want to have that information, then there's not a whole ton you can do with them. It's probably better to move on to someone that is at least willing to observe objective truth. Hopefully that answered it. Oh, thanks for putting that. I see. I assume everyone can see the chat. The 13th, great film for not for light watching, right? So it's not like a grab your popcorn and jujubes or M&Ms and watch. It's a bit heavy. Okay, real quick, I would like to have everyone, there's a link that's going to appear in the chat box. I've got some questions that I want everyone to hop into SurveyMonkey and answer. Although the link is coming. There it is. And I'll give it a moment and I'll pop right back. And hopefully everyone can get to that link. While you're doing that, I will take some time and read the questions. Question number 1, I can turn on the television or look at the front page of the paper and see people like me widely represented in positive roles. Question number 2, when I'm told about our national heritage or about civilization, I'm told that people like me made it what it is. Number 3, I've never been asked when and how I decided my sexual orientation. Number 4, I am able to serve in the armed forces with few doubts about my suitability to do the job. 5, I am rarely asked to speak for all people of my cultural group. 6, I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own protection and safety. 7, I generally think of police as people I can call on in times of emergency. 8, I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. 9, I can choose blemish cover or bandages in flesh color and have them more or less match my skin. And 10, there's a typo there, sorry. I have never skipped a meal or went away hungry from a meal because there wasn't enough money to buy food in my family. So those are the 10 questions. Some of you may have answered questions like this before. We are hoping that everyone can get to the link. I assume if you can't, you put something in the comments to Chelsea.
Yeah, if anyone is having a hard time accessing that link, please either raise your hand or type something into the question box, and I'll go ahead and send to you directly.
Yep, and hopefully I got a good answer on the shame thing. If someone has more, if they want more feedback on that, they can push back on that. Just one other thing I'll say about the shaming thing is that a lot of times what when you get that response where people sort of reject this is a lot. This is a lot of, remember I said this work is messy. I there's someone that that I work with that really had a tough time kind of gathering and sort of absorbing some of this information. And it's a lot, especially if you don't or haven't been exposed to it to begin with, right? If you have not had this particular type of education, and even like I said, there's nothing to be ashamed of. We have Rhodes Scholars on their way to Oxford that don't know who Ida Wells is, which again, different subject for a different day, but she's a journalist almost single-handedly responsible for making the American public understand what lynching was. If you don't have any of this information and someone dumps it all in your lap one week, it can be jarring. I think there is a bit of desensitization that goes on with the experience of being in a marginalized group that, you know, like I said, I've been Black my whole life, so I've known these facts a long time. It is not as jarring to me to hear about the police murder of an unarmed man. It's not, that's, you know, I think just kind of reflecting back to, there was a Netflix show that was a sensation a few years ago about a district attorney who framed a guy. Was it How to Make a Murder? I can't remember the name of it. It may be it. It may have been How to Make a Murder, but it was about a district attorney who had gone out of his way to frame a guy. And it was sort of like I had all of these friends saying, can you believe this show? It's outrageous. And like I watched like an episode and a half, and I was like, well, yeah, that's a thing. That's a thing that happens, because it is not. It's just not outside of the realm of my experience of what I have seen and heard and even witnessed in my life of law enforcement misbehaving as it pertains to chain of evidence and charging and all that stuff. So anyway, I digress. I was trying to do a little time. Chelsea, do you feel like you have enough content to publish some results?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good time to share. So I'll go ahead and get that up on the screen.
Okay, so what we're looking at, and I appreciate everyone that responded. This is actually a subset of questions from an exercise that I do with groups. Usually there are about 40 questions, but this is a subset of questions from an activity called a walk through privilege. And what I want to share with you guys is that all of these questions have absolutely nothing to do with your personal accomplishment. They have nothing to do with any achievement, none of that. This is all about the genetic lottery. And so we'll just go through the questions right quick. And it looks like about 75% felt like they could turn on the television and look at the front page and see people widely represented in positive roles. And what we do with groups, when I do this exercise, I usually have people line up in a field and have them visualize something that they really want. And every time one of these is true, I have them take a step forward, right? And so question number 2, when I'm told about national heritage, people like me made it what it is. Looks like we had a little bit more of a mixed response on that, but still 60% said yay. Never been asked when and how I decided my sexual orientation. This obviously gets at gender and sexuality. looks like more like 75% were not asked that question or would have taken a step forward with that question. Able to serve in the armed forces with a few doubts about my suitability to do the job. This is actually kind of a double dip because it reaches across both gender and sexuality and maybe even some transgender questions. That's about half and half. I'm rarely asked to speak for all people of my cultural group. That number, the 25%, this is something that seems to happen just in general, specifically with people of color, where I get asked for a Black perspective. And much like I mentioned with the information about my family and Juneteenth, you could probably ask 10 different Black families about Juneteenth and get 10 different responses because we're not a monolith. You could ask, I have a coworker that's Latinx, and he and I were talking about Cinco de Mayo. His family doesn't celebrate Cinco de Mayo for similar reasons, in that they don't recognize it. It's not significant to their family. So, but in marginalized groups, typically people are sort of identified as the spokesman for that group. It's another reason not to identify someone as the same and to kind of respect the difference. Moving on. I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own protection and safety. That looks about right. The only feedback I'll give on this is I had a conversation with a good friend of mine who's a bit younger, and he asked me one time why Black mothers were so mean, and I said, well, what do you mean? My mom's not mean. What are you talking about? He's like, they're always yelling at their kids. And I'm like, well, you know, with little Black boys, sometimes the consequence for misbehavior, the consequence for not following a rule can be life or death. And it's sort of there's a legacy of trying to act as a governor for behavior. Not saying that it has necessarily worked all that swiftly, but the sort of archetype of the overbearing parent has a lot to do with the consequences that Black children face in the real world, whereas their non-Black or majority group counterparts may not face those same consequences. Okay, moving right along. Police, that one's easy. I can be sure my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. Question 9 is always something that gets people's attention. I will say that today there are at least like brown bandages, but 10 years ago there weren't. And that really gets at just sort of, and Chelsea said it beautifully on our pre-call, that it really gets at living in a culture that is sort of designed for the majority group, that things like that just don't really come up. And then finally, this is about poverty and economic privilege. That's what that question gets at. So that is the walkthrough privilege. Whenever I do it with people, it always kind of works out the same. Different people end up at the head of the line, different groups. It's not ever surprising to me who ends up where in the group, but it is what it is. So, real quick, got just a few minutes left. I wanted to touch on, with that in mind, so if you think about how many of those questions you answer true or false to, if you think of a 10-step race, how far you would be along in the race, none of that has anything to do with your own personal accomplishment, and it's not bad. None of it's your fault. None of it's your achievement. But it is kind of crappy if you're 9 steps ahead of someone in the back. It's kind of crappy to look over your shoulder and say, hey, you must be lazy. Why aren't you up here? Right? You need to work harder, or pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get up here because you're already at an advantage, right? And a lot of times, I've done this before, I've done the cultural competency training in sort of rural areas, and where poverty is a big problem. And I get pushback from people where they say, hey, I don't have white privilege. What are you talking about? And it's not, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you got, like someone gave you extra stuff. It means that these things didn't start out counting against you, right? It means that these things aren't counting against you to begin with. So on the subject of equality and equity, on the left, there's equality. Everyone has the same thing, right? That's perfect. And it works really good for the two people on the left. The little guy on the right in the picture on the left, he can't see the game. Equity is a little bit more of a redistribution, and capitalists get unhappy with this because it does call for redistribution of resources. And I suppose it's about what your intent is. If the intent is that you want everyone to be able to see the game, that's great. A better picture, I think, is this one, and it is the removal of the barriers, right? And that is justice, right? So justice is that everyone can see the game, but if you remove the barriers, then you don't need to add the resources in. The challenge is we're nowhere near that, right? That's not how it is. And to the earlier questions around systemic racism and institutional bias, that is what that fence is. So until we dismantle that fence, there's not really a shot at justice. So, and there's a lot more we could get into with that, but I'm trying to be respectful of time. So, other questions?
We do have a question that I think would be good to address. What do you say to organizations that hold up token POC or people of color who may not always be advocates for people of color as the example of these organizations' dedication to DEI issues?
I want to make sure I understand the question. So what do I say, or what?
Yeah, what do you say to organizations who hold up token people of color as an example of their dedication?
I say the Annie E. Casey Racial Toolkit is a wonderful tool for implementing actual change. And it's easy to tell when someone is tokenized. It's super easy to tell because they're not really involved in any decision making, and they're not. It's just, hey, we have one of them, right? And unfortunately, sometimes that happens even as a lack of education, right? There are beliefs that just having people around of color means that you are diverse. It does not. Having people around that are people of color that are integral to your decision making and that are at the table and participating in decisions and have a voice, now we're getting somewhere. So again, organizations they're going to do what they're going to do, but asking the question is what is the real decision making involvement of that person? Is that person engaged in this? What is your plan? What is your we're in the process of redoing our strategic plan to infuse DEI into the plan, because it's not in there, and that's not acceptable, because if it's not part of the strategic plan, it's not going to happen. And actually, if it is part of the strategic plan, it might not happen. Those of you that have done strategic planning, but at a minimum, it needs to be there and needs to be woven into the fabric of the organization, and that takes work. So who's doing that work? Where are they? That it's in that vein.
It's 1 o'clock.
Oh. My computer saves me from being late for meetings all the time. So that would be my off the cuff response. And then again, to just not to do the shaming thing, right? But not it's one thing to say, yep, you have tokens, you're not doing it right. But maybe a better frame of that is asking those questions. What decision making are they involved in? And then, have you worked with someone? What steps have you taken to make a change? Are you interested in making a change? Are you happy promoting structural bias? Which I know it's a loaded question, but so be it.
Thank you so much, Phil. So I think we'll go ahead and just wrap it up there. We did have some questions that we were not able to get to, but we'll include answers to those in our follow-up email. So I'll go ahead and let you get to resources, Phil.
Okay, yeah, I'll just, a couple things. Get educated, right? So there is the tried and true route of ask a Black friend, but as I said, not everybody wants to do that. If you want just information about people of color, specifically Black people, or ask a Latinx friend, or ask a gay friend, or ask a poor friend, it's far better to get educated yourself and do the work yourself and look. More importantly, listen and believe, right? I think sometimes we don't, when people say I'm hurting, or I'm hurt, or this is happening to me, or I feel devalued, or people aren't treating me right, and sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, that's not really happening, or we're not really like that, so that's not going on in our organization. If someone tells you that, believe them, listen to them and believe them. Practicing humility and self-reflection, and then learn how to make repairs. Like I said, this work is messy, and it takes effort, and sometimes it takes a set of outside eyes to work on that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my mentor, Dr. Hawkins, from Georgia, who's kind of been my guide along this work. Her organization has really helped me in this path, and I always like to mention her in this, and a lot of this is based on her hard work. So that's it for me. I think Chelsea has some stuff.
Yeah, just a couple of reminders, everyone. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from us on Monday that will include a recording of this presentation, as well as a PowerPoint of the slideshow, and as well as CE credit. And then one last call to action. As you guys are closing out of your window, you'll be asked to participate in a survey. Please take that survey. We're looking for contacts or individuals who might be interested in becoming a part of a national advisory group on DEI. So if you're interested, please indicate that in the survey, or you can email us at any time at info@naatp.org. I want to say thank you again to everybody who joined us today, and thank you so much, Phil, for a great presentation.
Thanks.